One morning in 217 BC, nearly 30,000 Roman soldiers disappeared beside a lake. Not after a long battle, not after days of fighting, but in just a few hours. An entire Roman army simply vanished. No survivors returned to explain what happened. No messenger reached Rome in time. Just silence. The Roman army had been marching beside Lake Trasimene, confident, disciplined, unstoppable. On one side, the lake stretched into the morning mist. On the other, thick forests covered the steep hills. The road ahead looked quiet, safe, empty. But hidden inside those forests, thousands of enemy soldiers were already waiting, silent, watching the Roman column move below. They had chosen the ground, they had prepared the trap, and the Romans were marching straight into it. Within hours, thousands of soldiers would be dead. Many would drown in the lake beside them. And one man would prove something that Rome would never forget: that he wasn't just fighting battles, he was controlling the battlefield itself. His name was Hannibal Barca, and this ambush would become one of the most brilliant military traps in history. But the real question is, how did the most disciplined army in the ancient world walk straight into a trap they never even saw? If you enjoy deep dives into the greatest battles and commanders in history, subscribe to Clash of Ancients and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from today? To understand why this ambush shocked the ancient world, you first have to understand Rome. By the 3rd century before Christ, the Roman Republic had become the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean. Roman armies were not just large, they were disciplined, organized, relentless. Every Roman legion was built like a machine. Soldiers trained constantly. They marched for miles, carrying heavy equipment. They built roads and forts wherever they went. Their commanders followed strict battlefield formations, designed to hold against almost any enemy. For generations, this system had crushed Rome's rivals. Cities fell, kingdoms surrendered, armies were defeated. Rome had become something rare in the ancient world, a state whose power was built entirely on the strength of its army. But in 218 BC, that confidence was about to be tested. Across the sea in North Africa stood another powerful state: Carthage. Carthage had once fought Rome in a brutal struggle known as the First Punic War. Rome had won that conflict, taking control of Sicily and humiliating Carthage. But Carthage had not forgotten, and neither had one particular family: the Barca family. At the head of that family stood a young commander who had grown up hearing stories of Rome's betrayal and victory. His name was Hannibal. According to ancient historians, Hannibal's father once brought him before an altar and made him swear an oath that he would never be a friend of Rome. Whether that story is legend or truth, one thing is certain: Hannibal spent his entire life preparing for war with the Roman Republic. When he eventually took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain, he began building an army unlike any other in the ancient world. It was not a single nation's army, it was a coalition. Carthaginian officers commanded Iberian warriors, Celtic tribesmen, African infantry, and some of the finest light cavalry in history, the Numidian horsemen. Different languages, different cultures, but united by one goal: defeat Rome. And Hannibal had a plan that shocked the entire Mediterranean world. Instead of attacking Rome by sea, he would attack where Rome felt safest: Italy itself. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal marched his army north through Spain and into Gaul. Roman leaders expected him to stop there. No general had ever attempted what Hannibal planned next. Ahead of him stood the Alps, a towering wall of mountains separating northern Europe from Italy. Roman commanders believed those mountains were impossible to cross with an army. Hannibal proved them wrong. With tens of thousands of soldiers and dozens of war elephants, he began the climb. The journey was brutal. Cold winds cut through the mountain passes. Snow covered the narrow paths. Rock slides crushed soldiers and animals. Mountain tribes attacked from the cliffs above. By the time Hannibal descended into northern Italy, his army had lost thousands of men. But the ones who survived were hardened veterans, and now they stood on Roman soil. Rome responded immediately. Roman armies marched north to confront the invader. At first, Roman leaders believed Hannibal's campaign would end quickly, but they were wrong. Hannibal defeated one Roman army at the Battle of the Trebia River. The victory shocked Rome, but Roman leaders still believed the war could be won with overwhelming force. So they raised another army and placed it under the command of Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was not a cautious commander. He was aggressive, ambitious, and eager for victory. When reports reached him that Hannibal was ravaging the countryside of central Italy, Flaminius immediately began marching to intercept him. He wanted a battle, a decisive one, a battle that would prove Rome's superiority and end Hannibal's invasion. But Hannibal had already begun preparing something far more dangerous. He had begun choosing the battlefield. Flaminius believed he was chasing a retreating enemy. In reality, Hannibal was leading him exactly where he wanted. For weeks, the Carthaginian army had moved through the Italian countryside like a storm. Villages burned behind them, crops were destroyed, livestock was driven away. The smoke of ruined farms rose across the hills of Etruria. Every mile of destruction carried the same message to Rome's allies. Rome could not protect them. For the Roman Senate, this was more than a military problem, it was a political one. The Roman Republic depended on the loyalty of its allies across Italy. If those allies began to believe Rome could not defend them, the entire system could collapse. Flaminius felt that pressure. Every day Hannibal remained in Italy without being defeated was another humiliation for Rome. So Flaminius marched faster. His army moved through the hills in long columns, soldiers carrying shields, armor, and equipment that weighed more than 20 kilograms. Roman legionaries were used to long marches, but this pursuit was exhausting. Still, Flaminius pushed forward. Hannibal's army remained just ahead of him, always visible, always out of reach. Hannibal understood exactly what he was doing. He wanted the Roman consul angry. He wanted him impatient, because an impatient commander makes mistakes, and Flaminius was making them. Roman scouts reported Hannibal moving east toward the region surrounding Lake Trasimene. The lake lay in central Italy, surrounded by steep hills and narrow valleys. It was beautiful land, green hills, quiet water, and winding roads that followed the shoreline. But it was also dangerous terrain for an army, and Hannibal knew it. As the Carthaginian army approached the northern shore of the lake, Hannibal carefully studied the landscape. The road running along the lake narrowed into a long valley between the water and the hills. To the north of the road rose thick forests and ridges that gradually sloped down toward the lake. At one point, the hills pressed so close to the water that the open ground between them nearly disappeared. Anyone marching through that valley would be trapped between the lake and the hills. It was exactly the kind of terrain Hannibal loved. Instead of continuing south, Hannibal stopped his army and began preparing an ambush. During the night, his soldiers quietly moved into position along the hills above the valley road. Experienced African and Iberian infantry were placed where the Roman vanguard would emerge. Celtic warriors were hidden further along the slopes. Numidian cavalry moved behind the hills to block the road once the Roman army had entered the valley. Every unit had a role. Every position had been chosen carefully. The entire ambush depended on one thing: patience. The Carthaginian army waited through the night. No fires, no shouting, no movement that might reveal their presence. Meanwhile, the Roman army continued marching toward the lake. Flaminius believed Hannibal was retreating. He believed the Carthaginians were trying to escape, and he believed that if he moved quickly enough, he could catch them before they slipped away. What Flaminius did not realize was that Hannibal wanted him to move faster, because the faster the Romans marched, the less time they spent scouting the terrain ahead. And on the morning of June 21st, 217 BC, that mistake would prove fatal. A heavy fog settled across the valley beside Lake Trasimene. The mist rolled in from the water and spread across the low ground, covering the road and the slopes above it. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. From the Roman perspective, the valley looked quiet, peaceful, almost empty. Flaminius ordered his army forward. The Roman column stretched for miles along the narrow road. At the front marched the vanguard, the most experienced soldiers, ready to respond quickly if the enemy appeared. Behind them came the main body of the army. Thousands of legionaries marching in formation, shields slung across their backs, helmets glinting faintly through the fog. Further behind came the baggage train, pack animals and support troops carrying supplies. The Roman army moved deeper into the valley, and still the hills remained silent. From the slopes above, thousands of Carthaginian soldiers watched them pass. Hidden among trees and rocks, they waited for the signal. Hannibal himself stood somewhere along the ridge, looking down into the fog below. He could see the Roman columns stretching across the valley floor, but the Romans could not see him or the thousands of soldiers waiting beside him. Hannibal did not attack immediately. He allowed the Roman army to move further into the trap. More soldiers entered the valley. More units marched along the road beside the lake. The Roman column grew longer and longer until it filled the entire space between the hills and the water. Now the trap was almost ready. The Roman vanguard had reached the narrow pass at the far end of the valley. The main body marched beside the lake, and the rear of the column still entered the valley behind them. The Roman army had unknowingly stretched itself into the worst possible position. They could not turn, they could not regroup, and they could not escape quickly. All they could do was keep marching, and Hannibal was waiting for exactly that moment. High above the valley, Hannibal's soldiers remained hidden. Celtic warriors crouched behind rocks and trees, gripping their weapons as they waited. Numidian horsemen sat quietly beside their horses, ready to ride the moment the signal came. No one spoke loudly, No one moved carelessly. The success of the ambush depended on silence. Across the valley, the Roman army camped beside the lake. Their soldiers believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. Many expected a battle the next day. Some joked that Hannibal was finally cornered. Others sharpened their swords and cleaned their armor by the light of the campfires. Victory seemed close. None of them knew that thousands of enemy soldiers already surrounded the valley where they would march in the morning. History often describes battles in numbers: thousands killed, thousands captured. But behind those numbers were real people. Men who woke up that morning expecting a normal march. Men who had no idea they were walking into one of the deadliest ambushes in military history. So imagine yourself in that column. You are marching beside the lake. The fog hides the hills around you. Everything seems quiet. Everything seems safe. Would you have noticed something was wrong? Or would you have marched forward just like everyone else? The moment Hannibal had been waiting for had finally arrived. The Roman army had marched deep into the valley beside Lake Trasimene. The fog still clung to the ground. The column stretched for miles. Roman soldiers marched in long lines along the narrow road, shields strapped across their backs and spears resting against their shoulders. They believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. They believed victory was close. But Hannibal could see the truth from the hills above. The trap was ready. The Roman vanguard had already reached the far end of the valley. The center of the army marched beside the lake. The rear of the column was still entering the valley behind them. The Roman army was stretched out, separated, unable to form its famous battle lines. Hannibal waited until the last possible moment. Then he gave the signal. War horns exploded across the hills. Suddenly, the forests erupted with movement. Thousands of warriors charged down the slopes. Celtic fighters roared as they rushed toward the Roman flanks. Iberian infantry stormed forward from the forest ahead. At the rear of the valley, Numidian cavalry burst onto the road and cut off the Roman retreat. The Roman army had been surrounded. Chaos spread instantly. Roman officers shouted orders, trying to form battle lines, but the fog made it impossible to see what was happening. Units could not find their commanders. Commanders could not find their soldiers. The famous Roman formations, the tight shield walls that had defeated so many enemies, never had the chance to form. Instead, the Roman army dissolved into scattered groups of men fighting desperately for survival. Carthaginian infantry slammed into the Roman lines from the hills. Spears struck shields. Swords clashed against armor. The sound of battle echoed across the valley. Some Roman soldiers tried to climb the slopes to escape, but Carthaginian warriors were already waiting there. Others were driven toward the lake. The water that had seemed calm and beautiful only hours earlier now became a death trap. Many Romans tried to swim, but their heavy armor dragged them down. Others struggled through the mud along the shoreline, only to be cut down by cavalry. The fog made the battlefield even worse. Men could barely see more than a few meters ahead. A Roman soldier might suddenly find himself face to face with an enemy emerging from the mist. And then the fighting would begin. Small pockets of Roman resistance formed across the valley. Groups of legionaries locked shields and fought back with discipline and courage. But without coordination, those groups were slowly overwhelmed. The Carthaginian attack had come from every direction: front, flanks, rear. The Roman army had nowhere to escape. In the center of the fighting, the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius tried to rally his men. Ancient sources say he fought bravely beside his soldiers, but during the chaos of the battle, he was killed, reportedly by a Celtic warrior named Ducarius. When Flaminius died, the Roman army lost its commander. Any remaining order collapsed. Now the battle became a massacre. Carthaginian soldiers pushed the Romans back toward the lake. Thousands of Romans were forced into the water. Some drowned. Others were cut down as they struggled to climb out of the mud. The fighting continued for several hours, but the outcome was already decided. Within roughly 3 hours, the Roman army had been destroyed. Approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers were killed. Another 6,000 to 10,000 were captured. Carthaginian losses were far smaller, around 1,500 to 2,500 men. An entire Roman army had vanished beside Lake Trasimene, exactly as Hannibal had planned. When news of the disaster finally reached Rome, panic spread through the city. The Roman Republic had already suffered a defeat at the Battle of the Trebia the year before. Now another army had been wiped out. An entire Roman force had been destroyed in a single morning. For the Roman people, it was terrifying. Many believed Hannibal might march directly toward Rome itself. Instead, Hannibal continued moving through Italy. His strategy was never simply about defeating Roman armies. He wanted something bigger. He wanted Rome's allies to abandon the Republic. If enough Italian cities switched sides, Rome might collapse without needing to capture the city itself. For a moment, it seemed possible, but Rome adapted. The Senate appointed a dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius understood something the other Roman commanders had not. Hannibal was too dangerous to fight in open battle. Instead of attacking Hannibal directly, Fabius followed him at a distance. He harassed the Carthaginian army, destroyed supplies, blocked escape routes. But he refused to fight a major battle. Many Romans hated this strategy. They called him Fabius the Delayer. But the strategy saved Rome. The Republic survived. Years later, Hannibal would win an even more famous victory at Cannae. Yet despite his brilliance, Hannibal would never destroy Rome completely. Eventually, the war moved to North Africa, and in 202 BC, Hannibal was finally defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama. But the ambush at Lake Trasimene remained legendary, because it showed something rare in military history. A truly great commander does not simply win battles, he chooses the battlefield, and Hannibal had chosen it perfectly. The Battle of Lake Trasimene reminds us that strength alone does not win wars. Rome had more soldiers, more resources, more allies. But on that foggy morning beside the lake, none of it mattered, because one general understood the terrain better than anyone else. When you imagine yourself on that field, do you stand or do you run? And do you know the answer, or only hope you do? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Clash of Ancients, share this video with someone who loves ancient history, and tell me in the comments what you think made Hannibal such a dangerous commander. This has been Clash of Ancients. Some fields remember what was done on them longer than the men who did it. And I will see you in the next one.